Hello, and welcome to the Logistics Management Podcast Series. My name is Jeff Berman. I'm Group News Editor for Logistics Management Magazine and the Peerless Media Supply Chain Group. Today, it's a real pleasure to welcome Glenn Koepke back to our podcast. Glenn serves as GM of Network Collaboration for Chicago-based FourKites. FourKites is a provider of real-time tracking and visibility solutions across transportation modes and digital platforms. Glenn has a proven track record of aligning solutions to customer supply chain strategies and objectives for global organizations. Prior to joining FourKites, Glenn served in a variety of roles within the logistics services industry and worked extensively in the EMEA region and North America. At FourKites, Glenn leads the company's network enablement strategy, which is focused on scaling its industry-leading visibility solution to capture end-to-end supply chain visibility. These include things like supplier prepaid and outbound customer pickup freight, as well as its Lane Connect product, which allows shippers to collaborate with each other to maximize fleet utilization. Glenn also holds a BS from the University of South Carolina, and it's actually, I believe, his second time joining us on our podcast. So, Glenn, welcome back.
Thanks, Jeff. Good to hear your voice again, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pleasure to have you back on, and it's been a bit of a while too. So, why don't we sort of start with something to ease ourselves back in here, Glenn? And that was just sort of be looking at the logistics market sort of on a year-to-date basis in 2023. What's notable? What has jumped out at you? And I guess as a part two to that, Glenn, sort of how are things looking now on a market basis, say compared to a year ago at this time? So why don't we start with that?
Sure. If I were to start with kind of where's the market at right now, and I'll reference maybe some different modes or regions around the world. So present day where we're at this year and in this time frame is road freight in general is kind of at rock bottom. So it helps shippers out tremendously, right? Driving savings, budget reductions, all that. But carriers, 3PLs, owner operators are just dying right now. And so overall road freight in the US especially is just, I would say, in dire straits for those that are on the service provider side. For those on the shipper side, they're raking in savings, which has been, phenomenal for them and a good course correction.
Mm-hmm.
In Europe, we see something similar where rates are low. Supply is generally readily available. It's not as tough as we see in the US right now. Ocean-wise, very similar, pretty drastic reductions year over year. So, I would say that for those that were on the shipper manufacturing side a year ago and compared to now, their lives are a heck of a lot easier, a lot more stable, services up, dwell times down, costs are down. But for those on the service provider side, it's just tough, right, across all the modes of transport. And those that have assets or even non-asset companies, they're struggling on margin, customer retention, just trying to stay differentiated and just trying to get volume to keep trucks moving and keep vessels moving.
Right. Absolutely. Some great points there. And a nice transition, I think, to sort of how we're viewing or how you are viewing, Glenn, the current state of the freight economy. And as a follow-up to the current state of the freight economy, do you believe that we are still in a freight recession of sorts? You can start with either point you would like.
Yeah, I'd say that we're at the tail. We are in a freight recession. I think we're going to be toward the tail end of it over the next 4 to 6 weeks. There are some, things like the Yellow bankruptcy that, will help kind of give us a needed spark. Unfortunately, unfortunate circumstances to cause maybe a kick out of a recession. But yeah, generally, I'd say that we're at the tail end of it. We've got at least another 4 to 8 weeks to go. And the things are soft. But at the same time, I would say that service is generally high. One thing we see in FourKites data a lot is there's less carriers being utilized. Right? So think of like routing guide depth and metrics like that. It takes less carriers to be able to move freight. As a byproduct of that, companies generally have higher service standards. They know that if service is dipping, that they could easily be swapped out. And so there's a lot more scrutiny and micromanagement of on-time performance, both at pickup, but also destination as well. And, I think on the ocean side, there's still a lot to be determined. I think Q3, Q4, they'll be moderately better, but not a spark or a huge jolt, I think, like people want to see compared to where they were 2 to 3 years ago.
Yeah, no question about it. Now you look at sort of some of the things, the economic indicators that really speak directly to the freight economy. I've sort of been looking at what I've been calling the 3 I's, Glenn, and that's just simply inflation, inventories, and import activity. And they all seem to be doing different things, which obviously are influencing freight flows, different types of buying patterns, especially as it relates to inflation, and really to all of them. The recent CPI inflation number that came out was maybe a 1 basis point up, essentially flat. It had seen declines over a 12-month period leading up to that. Not the end of the world. I don't think that it went up ever so slightly. Inventories, we are seeing I don't know what to call it, maybe a subdued drawdown. And import activity, while down, looks to be getting a little slightly, in quote unquote, less worse. I don't know. Those are all things that have kind of been jumping out at me, and I'm just wondering what you think about sort of those 3 I's, if you will.
Yeah, I like the way that you break those down. I think, the thing I always said, especially during the pandemic, is that it's a double-edged sword. It was great for logistics. It was tough for logistics and supply chain, right? We were all stretched to the brink. There's major capacity issues. Pricing was at an all-time high, but that was driven by a strong economy, strong purchasing, strong discretionary expenditures by consumers and businesses. And so, yeah, I think that's consistent with what we see and hear from our customers. So, as a reminder, FourKites is working with a lot of the Fortune 2000 companies, a lot of the global 3PLs. One of the things we see changing on the inventory equation is inventory. It was hard to go get, right, in the pandemic and into 2022 even. People were still rationalizing product. There was minimum order quantities that were struggling to be met, and companies have really balanced inventory right now. One thing that we hear from a lot of the international shippers, though, is really a focus on nearshoring. Once again, unfortunately, now with the Panama Canal and some of the drought issues and the reduction in vessels that are being allowed through, is that it is further exacerbating the need to nearshore certain suppliers. And so it's hard to glean this from the data, even on our side, where we have a ton of import data, export data from all around the world. But it is very prevalent as we talk to international shippers, where they are trying to move critical product from a sourcing perspective to the US, to Mexico, to Canada, to other parts of South America. And there's a cost impact, but there's a trade-off. And, the ultimate risk equation has changed a lot over the last few years. And the Panama Canal is just another black swan event that is causing shippers to continue to invest in nearshoring.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So as we're now just past the midpoint of August, Glenn, a typical conversation or talking point, especially in pre-pandemic times, would be sort of the onset of the fall peak season. Although for reasons that we've discussed already, and just sort of looking at the tea leaves, by most indications, this year's peak season seems to appear as if it will be a bit muted, or with any big meaningful activity of any type really occurring later than usual, just because of so much inventory is already in place. How do you sort of view the 2023 peak season in terms of what expectations are or perhaps should be?
Yeah, I'd say that, from a service provider lens, if I think of, carriers, freight forwarders, 3PLs, vessel operator, this is going to be a season we want to forget, right? It's unfortunately kind of meek, right? Like, yes, it's going to bump up. It'll tick up maybe 5 to 10% from a demand perspective, but profit margins, companies are going to struggle. There's still excess capacity. So, what I would say is from a service provider lens, this will be a season we probably want to forget. From a shipper perspective, I think it's going to give a false sense of hope and promise into future budgeting, right? If you think about, supply chain talent, there's still turnover at a lot of companies. And what will happen, unfortunately, is people are going to see that, all right, Q4, logistics costs are relatively flat. Fuel costs, yes, they're higher, but it's still manageable. And I do think it's going to give a false sense of hope and promise as they go into budgeting for 2024.
Right.
And it's a cyclical market. We all know that. I've been in the industry for 20 plus years, and there's been 7 to 10 major cycles throughout my career. So we know it's going to cycle back into more of a service provider driven market. Indications are probably mid to late 2024 as to when that's going to happen. So those are things, just as a reminder for those that are on the manufacturing or shipper side that are listening, is don't create too much excitement when you get into 2024 planning. You got to remember that it's a cyclical market and costs are going to swing back, and the demand is also going to change. There's a lot to that's up for grabs in 2024 as well. So it'll be a relatively normal season for once in peak.
Yeah.
I think that will change back to what we're used to of chaos and big swings in 2024.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Glenn. And you talk about demand. The National Retail Federation, I believe it was late last week, put out their monthly economic report. And really, if you were to boil it down, the main thesis is or was that consumer spending, which obviously, as we all know, accounts for roughly 70% of all economic activity in the U.S. Is I don't want to say it's muted, but it's definitely sort of plateaued or leveled out. I mean, the retail sales data, which came out yesterday, pointed to ever so slight growth, which also serves as sort of an indication that people simply aren't spending as much at the moment, due to different reasons. I mean, do you think? And I guess I know I'm being long-winded, but my point is, you said that towards the midpoint of next year and after, it will shift more to a carrier-based environment. Do you think that could be aided by sort of any type of material bounce back in consumer spending? In other words, as they get moving more and things are cycling more, they're moving through more consumer-based demand purchases and related freight.
It will, yeah. So I think the move to more of a carrier-friendly market is contingent on kind of spending and consumer demand. One thing we see, what's interesting in our data, year over year, is volumes are generally flat by mode. When you look at the truckload and LTL and ocean in certain corridors, one thing that doesn't necessarily come out, and part of it's just how our data gets shared to the market and all that, but one thing that's interesting is, although the shipment count, so if you think of container count or road freight count or LTL count, those are kind of generally consistently flat. What it doesn't necessarily take into account is what's the order size. So one of the things we see a lot of from shippers and 3PLs too is they may be ordering similar amount of trucks, but the quantity or fill rate of those trucks is less year over year. So when you think of utilization or payload, right, those are common terms of how you're measuring how much content is in the actual containerized unit. That is down year over year. And so how it translates to, those in retail, as an example, like in grocery, they're still having to bring in, a lot of perishable trucks consistently, even dry goods. But what we're seeing is less content in those trucks because the overall demand has softened.
Okay. Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And, when we look over, I mean, obviously here we are in mid-August, there's not a ton of time left in 2023, roughly three and a half months. When we're looking over the remainder of this year and into next year, on a general basis, really, Glenn, what are some of the key trends and themes that we should be focusing on or looking at as we round out this year and head into next year? I mean, obviously the economy remains front and center. It's also an election year. So there that in itself provides things to monitor, and also, of course, we're not U.S. and China relations seem to be pretty frayed as well. And what might that mean for the global / domestic supply chain?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. I think a couple, obviously you mentioned election year in 2024. That's something I do call out as I talk to a lot of folks in the industry as something to watch out for. I think a lot of the labor unions and the agreements, there's been a lot of noise this year, right? Whether it's from railroad workers to the UPS with Teamsters, with the ILWU and PMA on the West Coast. Yep. So I think generally my view of that is a lot of organizations have taken advantage, rightfully so, of the timing. It's a soft economy, right? If there's a time to cause somewhat of disruption and really advocate for what you need, now is a good time to do it because the end consumer is not going to really get hurt too much in this.
Yeah.
And a lot of those agreements are, coming to fruition. And if they weren't, the federal government's going to step in. I think we may see that happen a little bit as we go into next year. I think the federal government will still be very active, right? They need to prevent and protect the U.S. economy, our ports, our infrastructure. So I think there's going to be a lot of excitement and a lot of noise that comes out of the election. How that translates into, spending and infrastructure projects, we'll see. But generally, if I were to say, okay, what happened in 2023? A lot of labor disputes, but a lot of them were resolved. So that's number one. Two is, and this is something I unfortunately predicted, I think a lot of us predicted early on in 2023, is when you look at these cycles and you go into a soft economy, you see a lot of consolidation. And I briefly mentioned yellow, but one of the things that you're going to see a ton of, unfortunately, the rest of this year is you're going to see a lot of trucks parked on the side of the road.
Yeah.
You're going to see a lot of truck drivers move into transferable jobs, whether it's construction or other laborious roles to try and make income. You are also going to see a lot of bankruptcies and mergers and acquisitions. You saw, Swift Knight make a big acquisition with US Express earlier in the year. We're going to continue to see more of that. Companies are really struggling to stay afloat on the asset side. Companies are parking assets. I hear about it every day. That it's easier and more profitable to not be in business than it is to try and make money driving trucks down the road. So, if I were to say what's going to happen the rest of 2023, we're going to see more and more announcements every week and month about consolidation through M&A or potentially bankruptcies. We're going to see a subtle spark in, a peak season, if we can call it that, but it's not really the jolt that we all want.
No, 100%. And you had touched upon yellow. There's clearly plenty to unpack there. Why don't we do it at a top level? I mean, yellow controls roughly 8 to 9% of United States LTL market share. There's a lot of other big players in that market. I mean, names that come to mind would be XBO, ArcBest, Saia, Old Dominion, as definitive market leaders. But 8 to 9% is nothing to scoff at. And obviously, there's a lot going on there as it relates to rates. The remaining carriers chasing that spillover yellow freight. So what does that mean for the LTL market? From, I guess, primarily pricing, but also, capacity utilization perspective as well.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of excess capacity available right now. So right, wrong, and different, a lot of the national LTL players and then regional players can swallow up that volume and not have a material impact. So, LTL networks are generally very asset intensive. They're very fixed networks. So between the other national players and the regional players, that volume can get consumed right now because of the soft market. If this happened a year ago, we're in a more doomsday type scenario. The challenge I think I see with yellow is, you got 30,000 employees that are now available in the market, some near retirement, some not. But, it's a sad circumstance. You have a company that's almost 100 years old that was, a huge amount of history and kind of consolidation through tough times and was a banner logo and a banner brand to
Yeah.
service, companies, and that just isn't going to be there anymore. I think it was Consolidated Freightways in the early 2000s was probably the last big LTL carrier to go belly up versus NEMF was more of a small regional player. So I think the challenge for those employees is it's a tough hiring market right now, right? Because it's so soft, demand is low, profit margins are low. These individuals are going to have a hard time finding employment in the logistics and in trucking space. So hearts go out to those folks, and hopefully everyone can land on their feet in a successful environment. But
Yeah.
what I think this is going to continue to call into question is how profitable and how scalable are business models. You see, if I think back to ocean industry 10, 20 years ago, there was a lot of infighting, there was a lot of price wars, and people chasing to really kill themselves from a cost perspective, and they just couldn't scale it. And this has happened, I think, with Amazon and some other companies where people get locked into pricing that isn't profitable for them, and they've got to meet those contracts. And so I think it's a huge reminder for the national players that you've got to be careful, you still got to be scalable, and your business profile has to be nimble. Yes, you want volume, but you can't sacrifice profit to do it. Otherwise, you may not be sustainable for the long haul. I think what we'll see out of this is the expansion of more and more regional players, and ideally they can take on some of the equipment and the assets there as well as some of the employees. But it is a shakeup of the LTL industry. It's going to impact pricing a little bit, not as much right now, just because demand is so soft.
Yeah.
That capacity is going to get swallowed up. Will things change? Let's say you fast forward 12 to 18 months and the LTL market and the economy is booming and everything else. What will happen? I think there's enough runway for companies to invest to be able to scale into additional capacity. So that 8 to 10% that Yellow had, I think will be a blip on the radar in 2 years when the economy's booming.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just to wrap up, Glenn, I know one of the last times we spoke, especially when we were still in the depths of the pandemic, really had to do with the e-commerce supply chain, how that sort of ruled the supply chain roost, if you will. Clearly, with demand down, a lot of people having already made their big material e-commerce purchases during the pandemic, whether it was for something like exercise equipment, home repairs and renovation, ping pong, pool table, whatever it was. Those are not really recurring purchases, and but those were a lot of the types of purchases that drove the e-commerce supply chain during COVID. How do you view the current state of the e-commerce supply chain now compared to the heights of the pandemic, and where might we see the e-commerce supply chain heading in the short term? Call it the next 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, so we see it growing, maybe growing from a investment perspective, I would say, maybe not necessarily from a order demand perspective, but it's hard to argue that the world, especially in the major first world economies, has really shifted how they buy. And so mobile experience, combination of brick and mortar and online is critical for a lot of retailers. So, although e-commerce demand and inventory levels have changed, we still see companies investing heavily in e-commerce capabilities and this new shopping experience, which is a combination of online, mobile, and brick and mortar kind of foot traffic in stores. So, will we ever move to a true only e-commerce model and no brick and mortar stores? No, I think it'll still last for generations to come. But we see a significant amount of investment, especially from a FourKites perspective, from a visibility, from a partnership perspective, e-commerce, final mile, especially. So you think of traditional e-commerce as, small parcel with the likes of, FedEx and UPS and the US Postal Service. But you also have this component of final mile where, you mentioned like appliances or home delivery. These are very fragmented networks. And so there's still a lot of growth in both traditional parcel e-commerce as well as final mile e-commerce, and things are soft now, but yeah, there's still a lot of exciting technology and automation that's companies are producing every single day within those spaces.
Yeah, no, well said. So this brings us to the end of our allotted time for today's podcast, Glenn. So on behalf of Logistics Management Magazine and the Peerless Media Supply Chain Group, I'd like to offer up a big thanks for joining us again today, and we look forward to having you on again in the future.
Thanks for having me. It was great to speak with you as always.
Yeah, and no question. And for those of you in our listening audience, please feel free to go ahead and check out FourKites. You can find them on LinkedIn, and you can also find Glenn Koepke on LinkedIn as well. And for those of you on Twitter, please feel free to go ahead and give us a follow, simply at LogisticsMGMT. And please go ahead and subscribe to our podcast if you are not doing so already. Just simply look for Supply Chain 24/7 wherever you get your podcast. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day, and we'll catch up with you next time.